Security Templates Part 2. In this nugget, we discussed security templates again, and this is kind of a part 2 where we started an initial discussion of templates, and we looked at the various settings therein. And then this nugget, we're going to start off with a discussion of SecEdit, because you want to be able to use SecEdit to create a rollback. If you don't, and you mess up something with the templates that you apply, they're maybe difficult to reverse. I mean, you can do it, but it could take a while to figure out all the places where something could have gone wrong. So with a rollback, you can go right back to what you had at a previous point in time, and then we'll see how to apply those using policies. Also, we're going to look at how to apply the policies using a baseline template as well as an additional template. And these will be a general focus of a baseline as well as a specific focus for more specific organizational units in our additional templates. And then we have some bandwidth considerations to consider as well. For example, there's one or two of those policies you don't want to implement every time because your policies will be refreshed by default every 16 hours. And all of your clients will have to download the whole thing every time if you do it that way. So just keep in mind some bandwidth considerations as well as how to reverse the policies that you have on your system in case something's gone horribly wrong with those. And we'll take a look at how to save yourself if that happens as well. Now in our last nugget, we got some settings configured in here and everything, and it might be tempting to go ahead and apply those settings. Now I mentioned before that you don't want to actually apply any of these settings until you have a rollback that you can work with. So for example, to do that, you'd go to a command prompt and you'd use a very powerful tool called SecEdit, and we've been using this since Windows 2000. Now with SecEdit, what I want to do is to run SecEdit / generate rollback, and then the / CFG. This refers to the configuration file, and I'll need the full path for this. The configuration file for which I want to create a rollback, and that will be my securedc.inf. And then a / rbk, which will specify the name of my rollback file itself. I just called it oops.inf in case something goes wrong here. And then a / log file for oops.log in case, again, something goes wrong and I want to see it in the log file. And I'll just press enter. Now, notice that when you run SecEdit here, that it's not going to actually do any changes or be able to allow you to roll back any file or registry changes. I think it says, yeah, there it is. It's not supported for file security and registry security. Do you want to continue the operation? Yes. Press enter. It creates the rollback file, and it has a oops.log file for me to look at as well. Now once I've done that, I'm going to go to the file system, and since I didn't specify a path in a specific location for oops.inf and the oops.log file, it's just going to put it in the root where I ran the command. So here's my C drive, here's my oops.log file, and this is going to look very similar to my NLab secure file because really all it's identifying is mismatches between the two. So I'll go ahead and find a file. I'll look for a mismatch again, and then it shows me, again, this is where we had a difference, my minimum password age, all my password items in there. And then if I look at the oops.inf file, this will identify for me any of the differences between the local computer settings and that template file. So if I double click on that, then it's going to show me again, here's where my differences were, my minimum password age and all that kind of stuff, so that if I realize that somehow importing that securedc.inf file as security settings for this domain controller caused a problem, then I can use this oops.inf file to bring it back into the database, and then of course I would clear the database, bring in the oops.inf file, and then reapply this. Now, notice that it still has not actually applied the changes, even though I've run the rollback command. That's just created my backup file, my oops.inf file. If I analyze the computer again using the same settings here, we'll see that still for my account policies, my password stuff still has not changed. But if I want to do it on this local computer, I can right-click and then configure computer now, and then OK. Again, it gives me an output for a log here. And then now what I can do is to, again, compare it by analyzing the computer. And this time when I do it, I go to account policies, password policies, and I see that I'm now in compliance. But I've only applied that to this local machine. What if I have a bunch of different domain controllers I want to apply this stuff to, and I don't want to take all day by doing this on onesie-twosie basis on each individual computer or workstation? Well, for that I'm going to use group policy, but first let's go ahead and open and analyze the database now by using a different template. I'm going to open up my templates again, and this time I'm going to go back to that oops.inf file because I want to set everything back to the way it was before, so I can show you how to do this also by using a group policy. So I'll clear the database, open this, and then I'm going to, again, analyze the computer now. And we've seen me do this before in the past. I'm kind of quickly going through this now. Now we're not in compliance again, but that's because we're not in compliance with the weaker characteristics of this template. So now we'll just go ahead and configure the computer now again using the weaker settings. And if I go back and once again analyze, then it will allow me to see that. Now we're back to where we were in the first place, where we had no password settings here. Okay, so that's okay for now. We're just going to leave that temporarily, and we're going to apply this all using now a group policy object. And again, of course, if you plan to do this a lot, you can save this console. Now let's call it security config, for example, and save it. Now then, to work on this with domain controllers, because remember I'm working with the domain controller policy template, and I want to be able to import it to the domain controller's OU here, I'll right-click, choose Properties, go to Group Policy, edit the policy, and then I'm going to go to Windows Settings, Security Settings. Now, from within Security Settings here, let's go ahead and first confirm that we do have the insecure settings that we don't want to keep. The password policy, here's all that weak password stuff. So I'm going to go to the Security Settings, right-click here, and choose Import Policy, which guess what that does is it imports the policy of my choosing. No, not the insecure one. I'm going to go to Windows and then Security and then Templates, and then we're looking for the secure domain controller.inf. Now, if I'd imported a template file previous to this time, then I might want to clear the database unless I wanted to concatenate both settings. In this case, it doesn't much matter either way because I'm only working with a single template anyway. And then now once I've done that, I go to password policy, and now I see it's got the more secure, more strict password policies here. Now the next thing to understand is it's pretty good to have a strategy in deploying of these policies. So for example, the best thing to do is to start off with what we call a baseline template. And that would be a template that I apply to NuggetLab.com, and I want it to apply to all computers, regardless of whether you're desktop, domain controller, or server, whatever. And this would be settings that apply broadly for all these machines. And the advantage of that is that when I apply those settings broadly, then I don't have to duplicate the settings at the desktops, and then duplicate the settings on the domain controller's templates, and then duplicate the settings on the server's templates. So I can have just one setting that applies broadly. And then I can have more specific settings on specific organizational units. For example, for my domain controllers, that's the only one that's going to really matter in terms of the password policy, because the desktops and the member servers, they're going to get their password settings from the domain controllers anyway, so we would be specific about that. If we had desktop settings, then we could also configure those settings as well in their own template.inf that we would then import here, as well as for servers. And these would be then considered additional templates. So we have our baseline template, here applies broadly, and then additional templates that apply on more specific organizational units. Now, another thing to keep in mind with that, by the way, is that when you apply a template to any of these items, let's say on NuggetLab.com, don't be tempted to say, I want to apply the setupsecurity.inf template to NuggetLab.com, because I want to make sure that all of my systems, or their domain controllers, desktops, or servers, that they all get at least that baseline installation, and then we can add additional templates to that. I don't think you want to do that, because you see, that particular template file is 784 kilobytes, and you see, all of these machines are going to refresh their policy by default every 16 hours, and they're going to download 784 kilobytes every 16 hours on staggering basis, depending on when they started up and all that kind of stuff. Well, you can imagine that, especially in a large organization, that's going to generate quite a network load, and it's going to be unnecessary traffic. Now, the slight exception to that would be our domain controllers, which have the policies already stored on their local machines, and they apply and read them locally anyway, so they're not really transmitting that across the network. But otherwise, any of these other locations where I apply a template file, it's going to have to transmit that across the network. And most of the default templates that are there are only, 8 kilobytes, somewhere less than 10 kilobytes, so that's not going to be overwhelming. But you certainly want to keep that in mind in terms of whatever custom templates you create and how large they might be. Let me just give you a little bit of a redefinition of our computer roles here as well. I still have these two domain controllers for NuggetLab.com, but in previous Nuggets I'd had DC Nugget 3, which was a domain controller for Tucson.NuggetLab.com. Well, I've decommissioned that domain, and now DC Nugget 3 is simply a member server, actually a standalone server, so it's not a member of Active Directory in any respect. And then I also have DC Nugget 4, which is just a member server within this same domain. Now, let's go to DC Nugget 3. What I want to point out with this is what you do with computers that are standalone machines. Maybe they're not part of the domain because if they ever get their security compromised, you don't want to simultaneously compromise the domain itself. So maybe you want to set a server out at times to be on its own, and that's what I've done with DC Nugget 3. In that case, how am I going to import the security in a quick and efficient way? Well, one way I could do that is to again use the MMC console and to use security configuration and analysis and the templates there. And the other thing I could do is to use the secedit command from a command line, and I pre-typed this in here so you wouldn't have to watch me hash all this out. Anyway, for this kind of purpose and for standalone machines, you'll probably want to put something like this in a batch file so that you can apply it to multiple machines at one time. And then you just do secedit /configure. This means that I want to configure it with a specific security template. I'd do a /DB to specify a database, which I had created previously offline using security templates, security configuration and analysis. And then a /CFG to configure it by using the following template, which is secure WS. You can't really see off at the end there because that kind of scrolls off. Secure WS.inf. Now, this is not a workstation. It's a standalone server, but it will still use the workstation templates if it's a standalone server. And then we have a /log and then a secure workstation .log. Now I'll go ahead and press enter here, and it goes ahead and applies that template, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So although I don't think you need to absolutely memorize verbatim every single little syntactical item that you can use there, I sure would know that you can use secedit with a /configure to be able to use a template. Now, I've gone to the Help and Support Center here where we go to command line reference, and I just want to point out that all the secedit switches are right here within the online help system, and they're very useful switches for identifying the proper syntax here. For this configure one here, this is all the same stuff that I've shown you. Only thing that's additional that you might find interesting is you can also enter in a /areas, if I can use the mouse, /areas here, where you can say, you know what, I like most of the template, but really I only want one specific area to apply to this particular system. In that case, I can do a /areas and say, I only want to have the user rights apply here, and you simply /areas space, and then user_rights, and that'll apply only that part of the template. Because if you look at the template files, there are bracketed sections that will identify these different categories for you. And then another thing you might want to do is to use the /quiet item, and you can do that for a lot of these different things that we can use for secedit. And that way it does not display to the user what's going on with secedit, and that might do a couple of things. Number one, cut down on support calls in case somebody thinks something's wrong. And number two, just as a security matter, you might not want people to know that you're changing the security on a specific machine. Now, another function for secedit, actually there are several, in addition to generate rollback, which we discussed, as well as export, which we just discussed, is the analyze, export, and import, which you can also do with security configuration and analysis. Now, if it's not practical to visit a workstation and to use that MMC console to do those functions, you can use secedit. You might do that in something like a script or a batch file or something like that, and then you could just access those machines through UNC path to an administrative share, like a $$ administrative share that all administrators have access to. And then you could just analyze the text log file for all of those kinds of things, or you could import or export whatever template files you needed to. So secedit can be very useful for that kind of thing, again, especially for machines that are not part of your domain or that are remote and that are hard for you to really access in any other way. Now, the other thing you could do here is to use secedit validate, and that one's pretty good because remember the files that we actually looked at earlier, you know, secure workstation.inf and all this stuff? I mean, you could get in this thing, if you wanted to change this stuff using this instead of security configuration and analysis, I could just hack away at this thing in Notepad and try to change stuff. But that's not recommended because you have a really good crutch there with the user interface on security configuration and analysis. Helps to prevent errors. But if you're just a hardcore Notepad kind of person, then you want to make sure that if you've made any changes to the text file itself, that you validate them here. And that'll simply validate the syntax of whatever you've put into that template file. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how we'll actually implement all these security template changes and implement them into policies for each individual part of our organization, starting with a baseline template that we can put on NuggetLab.com, and then having a desktops template, domain controllers template, and a servers template, each of which will have additional settings. Now, for the NuggetLab.com baseline template, let's say that I want to, for this one, go ahead and clear the paging file every time the system shuts down, any of these computers shut down. And that's the security measure that you might do so that there's nothing sensitive left in the paging file that someone might be able to exploit by booting from a boot floppy or something like that and somehow being able to read that information. It's a little bit obscure, but there are organizations that require this, especially if they're under certain kinds of contracts where the contract requires that they do things like clearing that paging file. So anyway, I'd right-click here, and then I would go ahead and go to its properties, and then like we've seen before, I'd go to the group policy, and I'd go to the default domain policy, or I could create another one, doesn't matter. And then go to the Windows settings, security settings, and again, here's where I would then import the policy. Now I've already, in the background and offline here, gone ahead and created separate templates for both the baseline, the domain controllers, the servers, and the workstations. So those have already been created. And in fact, here are the templates that I've created offline. Here's baseline.inf, where I'm going to go ahead and clear the paging file on the shutdown. And that's a setting that, if I recall, is actually a registry setting. So let's go ahead and look for page and see if we can find it here. Here it is, the memory management, clear page file at shutdown, and then it gives a value for that. So we're going to clear the paging file with that one. And then the only other setting I made for all of the other ones, including domain controllers, servers, and desktops, was to change the name of the local administrator account. So, for example, with the desktops, I'm changing the local administrator's account from administrator to Q McCracken here. Okay, so I'm changing the name there. Why? Because that makes it a little bit more difficult to determine which account is the golden account that I want to really crack, because most hackers will go after the administrator account. Now, there are other easier ways of figuring out that Q McCracken is actually the administrator account. For example, the administrator account always ends in a -500 in terms of its SID. So they could find it out, but at least it puts a little bit of a speed bump there. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to go ahead and go to these security settings, and again, I'm on the default domain policy, so this is where I want to put my baseline. I'm going to import a policy, put my baseline settings into this, and then this is going to apply to all the machines on a global basis, including domain controllers, servers, and workstations, all the way down through this hierarchy. And the next thing I'm going to do then is to go ahead and set up a different setting now for our desktops, our domain controllers, and our servers. So I'll go to desktops, right-click here, go to its properties, again, group policy, and I'm going to not do this repetitively. I'm just going to, I got to create a new one here because I don't have any policies for this one. I'll just call it desktops. And I'll do a similar thing for the servers in just a minute here. And then I'm going to link all the policies, or rather import all the policies for both the desktops, domain controllers, and for the servers, and then I'll come back to you when I'm done with all of that. Oh, and then also I want to make sure that I take DC Nugget 4 and I move it out of this generic computers container and put it into the servers container, or your organizational unit, because otherwise it will not receive any of the policies that I set on this OU. I've already gone ahead and changed all the policies for all those, imported all the security policies. Now let me just show you a quick little tool here, and this is something I'm going to do so they don't have to go to each one of those machines physically and restart them so that they get the new policies. I'm going to use the shutdown command, and it's just type in shutdown, and I'll do a /I. Now you don't have to use the I, but I do that because it's easier, because it brings open the graphical user I for interface here. And then you add in the name of the computers you want to shut down. So I'll just enter in all of these names and click OK and specify that I want to restart those computers. And if there are users seated at that workstation or server, then I can warn them of an action, and then it'll give them a countdown timer so that they can quickly save their work and all that kind of stuff. In this case, there's nobody there, so I don't have to set a warning. And then I can enter in what kind of a shutdown it was, whether or not it was planned and whether it was unplanned and so forth. And I can enter in a comment for that as well. This shows up in the event log then on each one of those servers or workstations. So I'll just put in like refresh policy, and then I'll click OK, and then that'll restart all of those computers. Now here I've used remote desktops again, and I'm going to connect to DC Nugget 2, which is a domain controller, this member server, and this client XP workstation to show how these security templates have applied to all of these different computers. Now DC Nugget 2 is also a pure domain controller, so all I did with those, and I didn't mention this before, rather than changing the name of the administrator on domain controllers, because you can't do that on a domain controller, instead of just changed some of the audit properties. So if I go to this DC Nugget 2, and I go to administrative tools, and Active Directory users and computers, this would actually be the same thing that will appear on DC Nugget 1, but as long as I'm here, I'll go ahead and show it. And I'll go to domain controllers to go to its properties, and then look at the group policy here. And you'll see that what I've changed here, away from the default setting under Windows settings and security settings, is if we go into the local policies, there's an audit policy here, and now I've got audit privilege use normally is not configured. Now that it's turned on for success and failure. Now, probably in the future, I'll just turn this back off to only failure, because success, there's a bunch of stuff that goes on in the background that we don't really even see directly in front here. So success also will cause this audit log to fill up quite quickly, this event log to fill up quite quickly for that. And those logs will appear in the security event log. So that's for domain controllers. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of these other items over here. How about DC Nugget 4? Well, here we had changed the name of the administrator, the local administrator. If we go into computer management, we see that indeed this that used to be administrator is now D. Milesford, whoever that is. So that looks a little bit less obvious than administrator. And then same thing with client 01. That administrator's account's name has been changed to Q McCracken, Quentin McCracken, or something like that. I don't know. So anyway, we changed that guy's name from administrator to Q McCracken, and therefore looks like our templates have worked pretty well. Now let me quickly return back to the security configuration items, and this might be another item that you looked at and you were wondering what this was, the restricted groups. You see, with these groups, I can configure the local group membership on any of the workstations or servers that I want, unless it's a domain controller where, once again, we use Active Directory accounts. But with these local groups, for example, on all my Windows XP workstations, I might want special membership in that administrator's group. So I'll double click on this, and we see that the default settings are the trainer, which I already put in there manually, and then the domain admin's account, the enterprise admin's account, the administrator for the domain account. So I could do those, and then maybe I also have for my workstations or desktops an additional group I want to put in here, maybe the help desk group. So I'll click on add here and enter in the help desk group. Now also don't forget, once you've done this, to manually check these other ones that you do really want to retain in there, otherwise it'll clear those out. And then you'd click OK. And from this point, once you save the template and all that kind of stuff, it's going to come back into the policy if you import it like I did here, where if we go into My Computer, right-click and choose Manage, and then if we go to the group memberships over here, local groups, then if I double-click on Administrators, I see that sure enough, there's the Help Desk membership in that Administrators group. So this is very handy for making sure that the Help Desk, or whoever you want, gets to have group membership where they need to so that they can perform the job tasks they need to perform. Now also, what if somebody imports a template that totally goes bad, and it's, of course you wouldn't do this, but somebody else does this. Somebody imports a template that totally goes bad and it destroys the domain, or destroys the domain controllers. And now nobody can log on, and people are blaming you, and you're running around trying to find a new resume, calling headhunters and all that kind of stuff. Well, what you can do with this is, if this has totally gone bad, you actually can get this back to the same condition that these policies were in during an initial installation of the domain. Now, this is only for troubleshooting purposes at the worst case scenario, because it'll wipe out any other policies you've also put into this. But simply go to a command prompt and type in DC GPO fix /, and then you can type in ignore schema. And that's only useful if there's more than one version of the schema in the enterprise. Not very likely if you're on Windows Server 2003 and you haven't had any upgrades from Windows Server Windows 2000 or anything like that. And even if you do have different versions of the schema, you ought to bring those back up current anyway. You should have the same version of the schema all around. And then the other thing you would do is to specify the target. And that could be one of three things, actually. Target could be either the domain. You just type in the word domain here. And that would mean the default domain policy. Or you could do target DC for the default domain controllers policy. Or you could do both. And that's what you would do if you had both of them, of course, messed up. Now let me point something else out here as well. If you do a /, then that seems to implicate that you do /target : space and then domain. Don't do that. You don't put a space after that item. It's DCGPO fix target, and then no space. And then in this case, let's just do both, just for good measure. Press enter. It tells you, whoa, warning, Will Robinson, this is about to override everything. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes. Are you sure you want to do this? Because it's also going to replace anything like user rights assignments, which could have pretty big implications if you have applications that have specified individual user rights assignments there. And I'll go ahead and say yes for that. And then it's reset everything successfully. We don't see any error messages, so this sets us pretty much back to where we were at ground zero when we started this whole thing. In this nugget, we continued our discussion of security templates, and we started off with the discussion of the SecEdit command line utility, which allows us to generate a rollback so that if you goof something up with templates, you can always get back your original settings. You can also use SecEdit to do things such as import, export, some other things that you were also able to do using the Security Configuration and Analysis console. Then we also took a look at the various policies that you can work with. When you work with policies, you can really pretty much be applying INF templates to a baseline configuration, which is a broad scope that applies to all of the computers within that scope, and then the additional security templates, which would apply mostly to other things such as organizational units, for example, that are underneath where the original baseline applies. Then we'll take a look at some bandwidth considerations. For example, the setup security.inf file, you don't want to apply that every time because that's like 700 and some kilobytes, and all of your clients refresh their policies every 16 hours or when they start up. Man, that's going to be a lot of bandwidth used if you just apply that every time. So just